June 6, 1944. 0630 hours. Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. Corporal Waverly Woodson Jr. couldn't feel his legs anymore. The shock, probably. Or the shrapnel buried in his thigh, back, and buttocks. Metal fragments from the German mine that had exploded directly beneath his landing craft 30 minutes earlier. The cold Atlantic water had temporarily numbed the pain. Now, dragging himself up the blood-soaked sand of Omaha Beach, the pain was returning with interest. Each movement sent fire through his nervous system. Each breath felt like his last. Around him, men were dying, screaming, drowning in 2 feet of water because wounds or equipment weight kept them from standing. The beach was a slaughterhouse. German machine guns positioned on the bluffs above had turned the landing zone into a killing field. Woodson was a medic with the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the only black combat unit to land on D-Day. His job was to treat wounded soldiers and keep them alive enough for evacuation. But he was wounded himself. Badly. By every military protocol, he should be seeking medical attention, not providing it. Woodson looked at the carnage around him, looked at the medic armband on his sleeve, looked at the aid station, just a hole dug into sand behind a disabled tank where other medics were already overwhelmed. He made a decision that would define the next 30 hours of his life. He crawled toward the aid station, leaving a trail of blood in the sand, and began treating wounded men. For the next 30 hours, through D-Day and into D-Day +1, Corporal Waverly Woodson would treat over 200 wounded soldiers. He would amputate limbs with a field knife. He would resuscitate drowning men using mouth-to-mouth. He would pull wounded soldiers from burning vehicles. He would work until he physically collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion. And he would treat German prisoners with the same care he gave American soldiers. An act of humanity that would break something fundamental in those German soldiers' understanding of race and war. What makes this story remarkable isn't just Woodson's heroism, though his actions that day were extraordinary by any measure. What makes it remarkable is that the United States Army, for 75 years, refused to officially acknowledge what he did. His commanding officer recommended him for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation was endorsed by everyone who witnessed his actions. Multiple journalists wrote about the Negro medic who saved 200 lives on Omaha Beach. And when the Army quietly filed the recommendation away and forgot about Corporal Waverly Woodson. This is the story of a man who performed one of the most heroic actions in D-Day history, witnessed by hundreds of soldiers, documented by war correspondents, undeniable in its magnitude, and was erased from the official record because the Army didn't want to give a Medal of Honor to a black man. This is the story of how German prisoners learned that courage has no color. This is the story America tried very hard to forget. To understand what Waverly Woodson accomplished on D-Day, you have to understand the obstacles he overcame just to be there. Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. was born in 1922 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was smart, honor student at Overbrook High School, interested in medicine and biology. He was patriotic. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, he wanted to serve immediately. The Army had other ideas about where black men belonged. In 1942, when Woodson enlisted, Army policy was explicit. Black soldiers could serve in support roles, cooks, stevedores, laborers, but not in combat positions. Medical training for black soldiers was severely limited because the Army didn't want black medics treating white soldiers. Woodson fought the system. He scored exceptionally high on aptitude tests. He volunteered specifically for medical training. He was persistent enough that the Army finally relented and sent him to medical corps training at Camp Lee, Virginia. The training was segregated naturally. Black medics trained in separate facilities with inferior equipment and received less comprehensive instruction than white medics. The assumption was that black medics would only treat black soldiers in black units, so full medical training was unnecessary. But Woodson excelled anyway. He absorbed everything: trauma care, emergency surgery, resuscitation techniques, treatment of shock, burns, and battlefield wounds. He studied obsessively, knowing that life would depend on his knowledge. In 1943, he was assigned to the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, an all-black unit tasked with one of D-Day's most unusual missions. Barrage balloons were large, inflatable devices tethered to the ground or ships by steel cables. They were designed to force enemy aircraft to fly higher, making them easier targets for anti-aircraft guns and reducing bombing accuracy. The 320th would be responsible for setting up and maintaining barrage balloons along the Normandy beachhead. It was considered a relatively safe assignment, important for the overall operation, but not frontline combat. The 320th would land after the initial assault waves had secured the beach. That's what they were told anyway. The reality of D-Day would be dramatically different. June 5, 1944. Evening. Aboard transport ships in the English Channel, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion prepared for the crossing. They were the only black combat unit selected for the initial D-Day landings, a source of pride mixed with deep anxiety. Corporal Woodson checked his medical supplies for the 100th time. Bandages, morphine, sulfa powder, tourniquets, plasma. His aid bag carried enough material to treat maybe 20 casualties. If he was careful, 30 if he stretched supplies. Looking around at the hundreds of men packed into the transport ship, Woodson did the math. If casualties were as heavy as intelligence predicted, and they were predicting 50% casualties in the first wave, his supplies would be exhausted in minutes. Private First Class Samuel Madison, a balloon handler from Georgia, sat beside Woodson, seasick and terrified. "Doc," Madison said. The men called all medics Doc, regardless of rank. "You think they'll let us fight? Or will they pull us back once the white units land? We'll do our job, whatever that requires." "You scared?" Woodson considered lying and decided against it. "Terrified, but that's not important. What's important is doing the job when the time comes." Around 300 hours on June 6th, the order came. Prepare to board a landing craft. The 320th would land with the second wave on Omaha Beach. Not after the beach was secured, but while it was still contested. The plan had changed due to heavy casualties in the first wave. More men were needed immediately. The barrage balloon mission became secondary. The primary mission was survival. 06:15 hours. Landing craft approaching Omaha Beach. Corporal Waverly Woodson stood in the landing craft with 31 other men from the 320th, all cramped together, sea-soaked, vomiting from motion sickness and fear. Through the open front ramp, he could see Omaha Beach, and it was nothing like the briefings had described. The briefings had promised, the beach will be secured by initial assault waves. Secondary waves will face minimal resistance. What Woodson saw was hell. Bodies floating in the water, burning vehicles, disabled landing craft, explosions sending geysers of sand and water skyward, and the sound, a constant roar of gunfire, explosions, and screaming men. "Oh God," someone whispered. "Oh Jesus God." The landing craft shuddered as it approached the beach. Woodson gripped his medical bag, mentally reviewing trauma protocols. Arterial bleeding, apply tourniquet. Pressure, sucking chest wounds, seal immediately. Shock, keep warm, elevate legs, administer plasma if available. He was reviewing these procedures when the mine exploded. The blast lifted the front of the landing craft, tossing men like toys. Woodson felt something punch him in the back, thigh, and buttocks, dozens of impacts simultaneously. No pain yet, just shock and the sensation of flying through air. He hit the water hard, cold, shockingly cold. His medical bag was still strapped across his chest, dragging him down. His uniform was soaked, heavy. Something warm was running down his legs, blood, probably his own. Woodson fought to the surface, gasping. Around him, men were drowning, weighed down by equipment, stunned by the blast, unable to swim in rough surf while wounded. This was the moment when training overrode everything else. Woodson grabbed the nearest soldier, Private Madison, unconscious and sinking, and pulled him toward the beach. His own wounds were screaming at him. Blood was clouding the water around him. He ignored both facts. Beach. Get to the beach. Get Madison to the beach. He dragged Madison through the surf, through the bullets churning the water, through the chaos. His legs worked on autopilot. Pain was distant, irrelevant.
The mission was everything. He reached the sand and collapsed. Madison beside him. Both alive, somehow.
Woodson looked at his own wounds for the first time. Shrapnel had torn through his uniform in multiple places. Blood was seeping from puncture wounds in his thigh, back, and buttocks. One piece of metal was still embedded in his back. He could feel it grinding against bone when he moved. By every protocol, he was a casualty requiring immediate evacuation. Around him, men were dying faster than anyone could help them. Woodson made his decision. He crawled, couldn't walk, legs wouldn't support his weight, toward the aid station that had been set up behind a disabled Sherman tank. 2 medics were there, overwhelmed, treating soldiers with catastrophic wounds. "I can help," Woodson said. One medic looked at him, saw the blood. "You need treatment. After. Let me help first." The medic started to argue. Then another wave of wounded arrived. Men carried by their squad mates, bleeding, screaming, dying. The medic turned away from Woodson to handle the new casualties. Woodson began treating wounded soldiers. The next 30 hours blurred into a nightmare of blood, screaming, and desperate improvisation. Woodson couldn't stand, so he worked from his knees, crawling between patients, dragging his medical bag, leaving bloody knee prints in the sand. A soldier with his arm nearly severed, Woodson tied it off with a tourniquet, injected morphine, and bandaged the stump. "You're going to make it, soldier. Stay with me." A man drowning in 2 feet of water, too weak to lift his head. Woodson pulled him up, cleared his airway, performed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation until the soldier coughed water and gasped air. A tank crewman pulled from a burning vehicle, covered in burns. Woodson applied burn dressing, administered morphine, and stayed with him until he died quietly 20 minutes later. Hour after hour, patient after patient, his own wounds kept bleeding. He could feel himself weakening from blood loss. Twice, other medics tried to force him to stop and receive treatment. Both times, Woodson refused. "Too many wounded. I'll rest when the wounded are treated." Around 1100 hours, the aid station received 4 German prisoners, wounded soldiers captured during the advance off the beach. They were scared, young, bleeding from various wounds. The American medics were overwhelmed with American casualties. Someone needed to treat the Germans, but priorities dictated treating American soldiers first. Woodson looked at the German prisoners. "I looked at their wounds, made another decision that defied protocol and prejudice. I'll treat them." He crawled over to the Germans, his own blood mixing with theirs in the sand. The 4 German prisoners watched Corporal Waverly Woodson approach with expressions that mixed fear, confusion, and something approaching shock. They were young. 2 couldn't have been older than 19. All were wounded, though not critically. Shrapnel wounds, bullet grazes, one had a broken arm from artillery concussion. And they were terrified. Nazi propaganda had told them extensive stories about American soldiers. Depending on which version of propaganda they had consumed, Americans were either soft and cowardly or barbaric savages who torture prisoners. Black Americans, specifically, were portrayed as subhuman, intellectually inferior, prone to violence. Now, a Black American medic, himself visibly wounded, blood soaking through his uniform, was crawling toward them with a medical bag. Grenadier Hans Weber, the oldest at 23, spoke some English. He'd been a university student before conscription. He watched Woodson approach and tensed, expecting what? He didn't know. Nothing in his training or propaganda had prepared him for this scenario. Woodson reached the prisoners and assessed their wounds with professional efficiency. "Sprechen Sie English?" Woodson asked. "Do you speak English?" "Some," Weber answered carefully. "Little English. I'm going to treat your wounds. Don't move suddenly. Understand?" Weber translated for the others. They nodded,
still frightened. Woodson started with the soldier with the broken arm, the most serious injury among them. He set the bone with practiced efficiency, splinted it with salvaged wood and bandages, and administered a reduced dose of morphine. "This will hurt," Woodson said before setting the bone, "but you'll heal." The German soldier screamed when the bone was set, then whimpered as the morphine took effect. Woodson moved to the next prisoner, shrapnel wounds to the shoulder and leg. As Woodson worked, cleaning wounds and applying bandages, Weber watched with increasing confusion. This wasn't torture. This wasn't cruelty. This was competent, professional medical care, delivered with the same attention and skill the American medics were giving to American soldiers. "Why?" Weber finally asked. Woodson looked up from bandaging. "Why what? Why do you treat us? We are enemies. You are—" Weber struggled for the word, then decided on the German one. "Verwundet, wounded. You are wounded. Why treat the enemy when you are wounded?" Woodson was quiet for a moment, tying off a bandage. Then, "You're wounded soldiers. That makes you my patient, not my enemy. I'm a medic. I treat the wounded. That's the job." "But you are Negro?" There it was, the question underneath the question. Woodson met Weber's eyes directly. "I'm a medic, a soldier, an American. Yes, I'm black. Does that matter to you?" Weber looked away, ashamed. "We were told things about American Negros, that you are inferior, not intelligent, not capable. And what do you think now?" Weber looked at his properly set arm, at the professional bandaging, at Woodson's calm efficiency despite his own wounds. "I think we were lied to." Woodson nodded and moved to the next patient. "Yeah, you were." Over the next several hours, Woodson treated dozens more wounded soldiers, American, British, and German. He amputated a gangrenous leg using a field knife sterilized in burning gasoline. He resuscitated 3 men who'd stopped breathing. He pulled 2 wounded soldiers from a half-submerged landing craft before it sank. And he did all of this while bleeding from multiple shrapnel wounds, while running on adrenaline and willpower, while other medics begged him to stop and let someone treat him. By nightfall on June 6th, Woodson had been working for nearly 12 hours without rest. His medical supplies were exhausted. His morphine was gone. He was using torn uniforms for bandages and seawater to clean wounds. And he was dying. Blood loss and shock were finally overwhelming his system. He could feel his consciousness fading. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. His vision was tunneling. Finally, around 2200 hours, Woodson collapsed. 2 medics carried him to an evacuation point, loaded him onto a transport, and sent him to a field hospital. There, surgeons removed shrapnel, transfused blood, and treated him for shock and exhaustion. He was unconscious for 18 hours. When he woke, he immediately asked how many casualties the aid station had treated. "Over 200, a nurse told him. "You personally treated more than half of them." "The Germans? The prisoners?" "Treated and evacuated with everyone else." Woodson closed his eyes and drifted back to sleep. He'd done his job. June 8, 1944. Field Hospital, Normandy. Corporal Waverly Woodson woke to find a white officer standing beside his bed. The insignia marked him as a colonel, high rank to be visiting an enlisted medic. "Corporal Woodson?" "Sir." Woodson tried to sit up. His body informed him that was a terrible idea. "At ease, Corporal. I'm Colonel Henderson, Medical Corps Command. I wanted to talk to you about June 6th. Woodson's heart sunk. He knew it was coming. An inquiry into why he'd violated protocol by continuing to treat patients while wounded. He'd be reprimanded, possibly court-martialed for disobeying medical evacuation orders. "Sir, I know I should have—"
Henderson held up a hand.
You're not in trouble, Corporal. Quite the opposite. Your commanding officer has recommended you for the Medal of Honor. Woodson blinked. Sir? Multiple officers witnessed your actions on June 6th. Multiple soldiers have submitted written statements. The consensus is that you single-handedly saved between 150 and 200 lives through extraordinary heroism. You continued treating the wounded while severely injured yourself. You performed complex medical procedures under impossible conditions. And you treated enemy prisoners with the same professional care you gave American soldiers. Henderson paused, choosing his words carefully. This recommendation will proceed through channels. You should be proud, Corporal. What you did was remarkable, but Henderson's expression suggested complications that he wasn't stating directly. With respect, sir, Woodson said carefully, I've never heard of a black soldier receiving the Medal of Honor in this war. Henderson's jaw tightened. There have been difficulties with recognition for Negro soldiers, but your actions were witnessed by hundreds of men. The documentation is overwhelming. This recommendation will be different. Woodson wanted to believe him, but he'd lived his entire life in a nation that insisted black men were inferior. He'd endured segregated training, inferior assignments, and constant reminders that his service was tolerated but not valued. I just did my job, sir. You did far more than your job, Corporal, and that will be recognized. Henderson left. Woodson lay back on the canvas ceiling of the field hospital tent. He saved lives. That was enough. If the Army wanted to give him a medal, fine. If they didn't, that was fine too. He hadn't treated those soldiers for recognition. He'd done it because they needed help and he had the skills to provide it. What Woodson didn't know was that his story was already spreading beyond official military channels. War correspondents who'd been on Omaha Beach had witnessed Woodson's actions. They'd seen a black medic treating hundreds of wounded men while bleeding from his own wounds. They'd seen him save lives through sheer determination and skill, and they'd written about it. On June 12, 1944, the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper ran a front-page story. Negro medic saves 200 lives on D-Day Beach. The article described Woodson's heroism in detail, emphasizing that he'd treated German prisoners with the same care as American soldiers. It quoted witnesses who'd seen him working for 30 hours straight, while wounded. It called him one of the unsung heroes of D-Day. Other black newspapers picked up the story. The Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Norfolk Journal and Guide all ran variations of the same article, celebrating Woodson's heroism and questioning why white newspapers weren't covering this story. White newspapers, by and large, ignored it. The official military reports mentioned the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion's successful landing and deployment. They did not mention Corporal Waverly Woodson by name. The Medal of Honor recommendation proceeded through channels. It was endorsed by Woodson's company commander, by battalion command, by medical corps leadership, and then it disappeared into the bureaucracy. Meanwhile, in German POW camps, Grenadier Hans Weber was telling his version of the story. Weber had been evacuated, along with other wounded German prisoners, to a POW hospital in England. There, recuperating from his wounds, he talked to other German prisoners about his experience. Weber told his fellow prisoners, "The Negro medic treated us. He was wounded worse than we were, bleeding through his uniform, and he crawled over to treat German prisoners. Professional medical care, same as he gave American soldiers." The other Germans were skeptical. "Negro?" asked one. "A Negro medic treating Germans?" "I saw it with my own eyes. He set my arm, treated my wounds, and gave me morphine. Then he went back to treating other wounded men. Americans, Germans, didn't matter to him. Just wounded soldiers who needed help. We were told Negroes were subhuman," another prisoner said, "incapable of such skill." "We were lied to," Weber replied flatly. "About the Negroes, about the American military capability, about everything. That medic was more skilled, more brave, and more humane than any German soldier I served with." The testimony spread through the POW camps. German soldiers passing the story to each other, adding their own observations. The Americans treat prisoners well. better than how we treated prisoners on the Eastern Front. The Negro soldiers fight as well as white soldiers, sometimes better. Everything the Reich told us about racial inferiority was a lie. These conversations were monitored by American intelligence. They documented the stories, noting that witnessing Black American competence and heroism was breaking down German soldiers' faith in Nazi racial ideology. But they didn't connect these observations to any policy changes. Black American soldiers remained segregated, treated as second-class citizens by their own military, while simultaneously converting enemy soldiers through demonstrated excellence. July 1944. Waverly Woodson returned to duty with the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. His wounds had healed, mostly. The shrapnel scars would remain forever, physical reminders of June 6th. But he was fit for duty, ready to continue serving. He expected his Medal of Honor recommendation to be resolved soon. His commanding officer had told him it was proceeding through channels. Surely any day now there would be news. Months passed, no news.
The 320th continued operating in France, then Belgium, supporting the Allied advance through Europe. Woodson continued serving as a medic, treating wounded soldiers, saving lives. No Medal of Honor materialized. By December 1944, 6 months after D-Day, it became clear the recommendation had been buried. Woodson asked his company commander what had happened. "I don't know," the captain admitted. "I endorsed it personally. So did the battalion. The recommendation went up to division, then to higher headquarters. After that," he shrugged helplessly, "it disappeared." Woodson understood. The Army didn't want to give the Medal of Honor to a black soldier. His heroism was undeniable, witnessed by hundreds, documented extensively. But acknowledging it officially meant acknowledging that black soldiers could be heroes equal to white soldiers. That acknowledgement would undermine the entire structure of segregation. So the recommendation was filed away, and Corporal Waverly Woodson received a Bronze Star instead, a respectable medal, but 2 levels below the Medal of Honor he'd been recommended for. The official citation for his Bronze Star mentioned meritorious service and dedication to duty. It did not mention treating 200 wounded soldiers while bleeding from his own wounds. It did not mention 30 hours of continuous work without rest. It did not mention saving lives through extraordinary heroism. It was the Army's way of acknowledging what happened, while simultaneously minimizing it. May 1945. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion prepared to return to the United States. They'd served with distinction through the entire European campaign, from D-Day through the liberation of France, Belgium, and into Germany itself. They returned home expecting recognition, parades, acknowledgement of their service. Instead, they found the same segregated nation they'd left, the same colored-only signs, the same assumptions about black inferiority. Waverly Woodson returned to Philadelphia. He enrolled in college using GI Bill benefits, earned a degree, and became a medical technician. He married, raised a family, and lived a quiet life. He rarely spoke about D-Day. When asked, he'd say he'd served as a medic, treated some wounded soldiers, did his job. He didn't mention the Medal of Honor recommendation that had been buried. He didn't talk about treating 200 men while bleeding from his own wounds. He lived with the knowledge that he'd been one of the heroes of D-Day, witnessed by hundreds, written about in newspapers, recommended for the highest military honor, and been erased from the official record. For 75 years, that remained the status quo. Waverly Woodson died in 2005 at age 83. He never received the Medal of Honor. He died knowing the Army had buried his heroism because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that black soldiers could be as heroic as white soldiers.
In 2015, a group of historians and veterans advocates began researching black soldiers who'd been recommended for the Medal of Honor during World War II, but never received it. They discovered Waverly Woodson's case. The documentation was overwhelming. Written recommendations from commanding officers, witness statements from dozens of soldiers, contemporary newspaper accounts, war correspondent reports, even German POW testimonials, all describing the same event, a black medic treating 200 wounded soldiers on Omaha Beach while bleeding from his own wounds. The advocate submitted a new package to the Department of Defense requesting that Woodson's Medal of Honor recommendation be reconsidered. In 2020, 75 years after D-Day, 15 years after Woodson's death, Congress passed legislation requiring the Department of Defense to review cases of minority soldiers who'd been recommended for the Medal of Honor but received lesser awards. Woodson's case was included in that review. As of 2024, the review is ongoing. Woodson's family is still waiting for the recognition he earned on June 6, 1944. Grenadier Hans Faber, the German prisoner whose arm Woodson set on Omaha Beach, survived the war and returned to Germany. He became a teacher, specializing in history. In interviews conducted in the 1990s, Weber was asked about his wartime experiences. He spoke extensively about the black medic on Omaha Beach. "I had been taught that Negroes were inferior, subhuman, incapable of the intelligence and courage that defines humanity. Then a Negro medic treated my wounds while he was bleeding from his own wounds. He worked for hours, treating hundreds of men, Americans and Germans without distinction, professional, skilled, selfless. That experience destroyed my faith in Nazi racial ideology more effectively than any Allied propaganda could have. If Negroes were capable of such heroism, then everything I had been taught was a lie. And I had to ask myself, what else was a lie? What other propaganda had I accepted without question? That medic, I never learned his name, saved my arm and possibly my life, but more than that, he saved my mind from the poison of racial hatred. He showed me through simple action that courage and skill have nothing to do with skin color. That lesson shaped the rest of my life." Weber died in 2003, never knowing that the medic who had treated him was named Waverly Woodson, never knowing that Woodson had been recommended for the Medal of Honor, never knowing that the American Army had refused to acknowledge the heroism he'd witnessed firsthand. Today, there are renewed calls for Waverly Woodson to receive the Medal of Honor posthumously. The documentation is clear, the testimony is overwhelming, the heroism is undeniable. But 80 years later, the recognition remains elusive. The story of Corporal Waverly Woodson is the story of black excellence erased by systemic racism. It's the story of a man who saved 200 lives and received a Bronze Star. It's the story of heroism so undeniable that even enemy soldiers testified to it, and still the Army refused to acknowledge it fully. German prisoners who witnessed Woodson's actions went home understanding that racial superiority was a lie. They'd seen a black medic demonstrate skill, courage, and humanity that contradicted everything they'd been taught. But America, the nation Woodson fought for, took 75 years to even reconsider acknowledging what he had accomplished. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach. A black medic treated 200 wounded soldiers while bleeding from his own wounds. He worked for 30 hours without rest. He treated enemy prisoners with the same care as American soldiers. He saved lives through extraordinary heroism. And the United States Army filed it under meritorious service. and moved on. The Germans learned from Waverly Woodson that racial superiority was a lie. America is still learning that lesson.